Hello again, everyone. This video covers all things equivalent units of production from Chapter 4. So calculating equivalent units of production as well as cost per equivalent unit of production. So in our process costing systems, each of these processing departments we spoke of earlier needs to come up with at least two numbers for financial reporting purposes. The cost of their ending work in process inventories, that'd be like a balance sheet item, right? And then the cost of its completed units that were transferred to the next stage of the production process. We want to show that department to department flow. And really the key or the linchpin to coming up with these numbers is figuring out some kind of unit cost within each department. So there are two primary methods for coming up with these numbers. The first one is the only one we're going to cover in this class. The weighted average method of process costing calculates unit cost by combining costs and outputs from all periods. You may recall the weighted average method of inventory valuation from your accounting principles class. Similar idea here. We're blending units that were worked on kind of in prior periods with units worked on in current periods. There's also a FIFO method, first in, first out. If you're interested in reading about that, it shows up in the appendix of this chapter in your textbook. But again, for our purposes, we're going to stick to this weighted average method. So some characteristics of that method, first and foremost, it really does not distinguish or make any distinction between work done in prior periods and work done in the current period. So it really is that blending together of everything that we've been working on in the past and through now. Now the equivalent units of production, which is going to be our measure of productivity or work, is expressed in whole units for every particular department, every processing department. And those are going to be equal to the number of units that we've completed and transferred to the next department, or finished goods if we're the last stop along the production line, plus the equivalent units, again expressed as a number of whole units, in the department's ending work in process inventory. So it's a combination of those two sub-measures, if you will. Now conversion costs we spoke of earlier, and really earlier in this chapter as well. Those are the costs that we incur to convert our raw materials, our inputs, into finished product. So conversion costs are direct labor plus manufacturing overhead. Now oftentimes, especially in sort of modern manufacturing, direct labor costs are relatively small in comparison to all the other product costs in any particular costing system. So typically that labor and overhead gets combined into this classification of conversion costs. Now, equivalent units, we said, are a measure of productivity or work, and they're expressed on a whole unit basis. So it's technically defined as the product of the number of partially completed units and the percentage completion of those units. And we'll look at some examples coming up here. Now, we need to do this because departments usually have some kind of partially finished units in beginning and ending inventories. So to make comparability a little easier and to simplify things, if we express all these measures on an equivalent unit basis, i.e. as full units, it makes those things a little bit more easy to digest or process. So equivalent units, again, the number of partially completed units times that percentage completion. We always make this calculation separately with respect to our different cost categories. So as we'll see in our examples with respect to materials costs and then conversion costs. So I want to get in that habit early. So let's assume Department A has 500 units in ending work in process, and those things are 60% complete with respect to all processing in the department. Those 500 partially complete units then are equivalent to 300 fully complete units. That's the 500 physical units times the 60% completion rate for a total of 300. So in this case, Department A's ending work in process inventory, we'd say would contain 300 equivalent units for the period. Now the official learning objective 2 here was to compute the equivalent units of production using this weighted average method. So let's look at another example here. Let's say Smith Company reported the following activity in its assembly department for the month of June. They had beginning work in process of 300 units, and we can see they were 40% complete with respect to materials and 20% complete with respect to conversion. They started into production 6,000 units in that same month. During the month, they finished and transferred out 5,400 units. And then at ending work in process, they had 900 units. And those things were 60% complete with respect to materials, 30% complete with respect to conversion. So to come up with equivalent units of production here, we're going to start with the units that were completed and transferred out of the department in that particular period. In this case, that's 5,400. Reason being, we don't have to worry about any completion rate there. If they've been transferred, that means they were 100% complete with respect to everything, materials and conversion. So there's no conversion needed to get to equivalent units. 5,400 units is 5,400 units. If you want to think of it differently, you can think of the 5,400 units transferred technically times 100% completion. So if that's helpful, by all means, keep that in mind. Now to that, we're going to add our ending work in process. Now in the case of this particular assembly department, they had 900 physical units in ending work in process. Those things were 60% done with respect to materials. So 900 times 60% means equivalent units of 540 with respect to materials. Again, very much want to stay in the habit of doing these things separately with respect to materials and conversion, since oftentimes they will have different completion rates. Now, if I add together the units completed and transferred of 5,400, plus the equivalent units then in ending work in process of 540 with respect to materials, that means the equivalent units of production for this period for this department are 5,940 with respect to materials. Now let's finish out the calculation with respect to conversion. We had the same 900 units in ending work in process, but they were only 30% done with respect to conversion costs. So 900 times 30% gives us equivalent units with respect to conversion of 270. So now the total equivalent units of production with respect to conversion for June here are the 5,400 completed and transferred, plus the 270 equivalent units in ending work in process with respect to conversion. 5,400 plus 270, 5,670. So just to recap real quick, equivalent units of production for any processing department are always equal to the units completed and transferred, technically times 100%, plus the equivalent units left in work in process. That's where we need to do a little math. We want to get those physical units times the appropriate completion rate with respect to either materials or conversion. Now remember, the weighted average method we're using does not care or does not differentiate between things that were in beginning work in process and things that were started this period. But if it's helpful, we can sort of think about the physical flow here. So in this department, we had 300 units beginning work in process. They were 40% complete with respect to materials. That doesn't really matter for us since we're going to blend them all together. But we started 6,000 into production. So we had a total of 6,300 being worked on at some point, right? 300 plus 6,000. 900 were left in ending work in process at the end of the period. So that means 6,300 minus 900, we must have finished 5,400. Right? We can sort of assume that we finished the ones that were partly done to start the period, 300, plus another 5,100 that we started and finished this period. But again, that doesn't really matter for the weighted average method. Bottom line, finished 5,400 and transferred them out. Then we had the 900 units in ending work in process that were 60% done with respect to materials. So there's our 540 equivalent units of production. Same idea for conversion, right? Same 300 units to start from a physical unit standpoint, but they were only 20% done with respect to conversion. Doesn't matter for weighted average method. We started 6,000 into production, had 900 left, so the difference, 6,300 minus 900, we transferred 5,400 that were finished. Plus the equivalent units in ending work in process, the 900 physical units times 30%, or 270, gives us our equivalent units of production of 5,670. So let's try one here. For the current period, Jones started 15,000 units and completed 10,000 units, leaving 5,000 units in process, 30% complete. How many equivalent units of production did Jones have for the period? Pause this, look at the answers, work through it, and then come back for the solution. and that would be 11,500. We had 10,000 completed and transferred that we count technically at 100%, plus the 5,000 in ending work in process that were 30% complete, so an equivalent of 5,000 times 30%, or 1,500. Add those together and we get 11,500. Point being, the beginning inventory doesn't really matter for us for this weighted average purpose. We don't even really need to know what it is. All that matters is what did we complete and transfer, plus what do we have in that ending work in process. Okay, learning objective 3 here was to take what we know about equivalent units and calculate the cost per equivalent unit using this same weighted average method. So let's get some more data here. Let's say that in one particular processing department, we had the beginning work in process inventory of 300 units. This is from the earlier example. They were 40% complete for materials, 20% for conversion, and here are the costs that were sitting there in work in process. A little over $6,000 in materials costs, a little under $4,000 in conversion cost. As we know from the previous couple slides, we had started 6,000 units into production, finished 5,400. Here's all the costs we added to production in June. Let's assume materials cost was a bit over $118,000 and conversion cost was a little over $81,000. And as we know, we had ending work in process inventory of 900 units, 60% done with respect to materials, 30% with respect to conversion. So what we want to do to come up with this cost per equivalent unit using the weighted average method is to add together all the cost associated with that cost category from the beginning work in process inventory and what was added during the period. So again, we want to do this separately with respect to materials and conversion. So what I'm saying here is this would be, if we're taking materials as the example, the cost of beginning work in process inventory with respect to materials, all the materials costs sitting there, plus all the material costs we added during the period, divided by the equivalent units of production with respect to materials. And then we would repeat that with respect to conversion. So let's do that here for our example. Again, here are all the costs given in the previous slides: materials and conversion, beginning work in process cost, plus all the costs added during the period. And here was our equivalent units pulled forward from that earlier example as well. 5,940 with respect to materials, 5,670 with respect to conversion. So to come up with that cost per equivalent unit with respect to materials, we're going to take the total materials costs, so that's the cost sitting in beginning work in process, plus the cost added during the period, 124,740 in total, divided by the equivalent units of 5,940, and that's a cost per equivalent unit of $21 even with respect to materials. Same idea for conversion. All the conversion costs, the stuff sitting in beginning work in process, plus all the costs added during the period, divided by the 5,670 equivalent units with respect to conversion, gives us a cost per equivalent unit there of $15. Now, if we wanted to know then the total cost per equivalent unit, then we can just add the separate costs per equivalent unit together. $21 with respect to materials, $15 with respect to conversion, for a total of $36. Let's try another example here. So Zenadrone Corp uses a weighted average method. Their first processing department, welding, started the month with 19,000 units in beginning work in process that were 20% complete with respect to conversion. The conversion cost in that beginning work in process was $19,500. An additional 88,000 units were started into production during the month. There were 15,000 units in ending work in process that were 80% complete with respect to conversion. A total of $795,000 in conversion costs were incurred in the department during the month. The cost per equivalent unit for conversion costs for the month is what? Rounded to 2 decimals. So pause this, work through that, and then come back for the solution. And that answer is C, $7.83. So here we had to do a little math to figure out how many units were completed and transferred. So we used sort of our basic inventory flow to do that. 19,000 units were in beginning work in process, plus 88,000 that were started into production, minus the 15,000 that were still not done at the end of the period, means we must have finished and transferred the difference, 92,000 units, in that period. So to come up with equivalent units first, we're going to take the 92,000 units completed and transferred now, plus the 15,000 units in ending work in process that were 80% complete with respect to these conversion costs, to get total equivalent units of 104,000. Now we can figure out that cost per equivalent unit. So take all the conversion costs, $19,500 sitting in beginning work in process, plus the 795,000 we added during the period, divided by the equivalent units of production of 104,000, and there's our $7.83. Next up, the cost assigned to units completed and transferred out will always use blank equivalent units with respect to materials and conversion costs, while the cost of units in ending work in process may use blank equivalent units with respect to materials and conversion costs. Pause this, think over those potential answers there, and come back for the solution. And that would be B. So the cost assigned to units completed and transferred will always use the same equivalent units with respect to materials and conversion, because, just pause there for a second, because those things are always 100% done with respect to everything. Otherwise, they wouldn't transfer out of the department. Okay, so always going to use the same equivalent unit number there. Okay, while the cost of units at ending work in process may use different equivalent units with respect to materials and conversion costs. And we've seen that in our examples already. Oftentimes, ending work in process has different completion rates with respect to materials and conversion. So oftentimes we'll have different numbers of equivalent units sitting in that ending work in process. Okay, that's where I'm going to end this video on calculating equivalent units and cost per equivalent unit. Back up to see anything you need to revisit. Let me know if you have any questions, and then move on to the final video for Chapter 4 here.